Welcome to Lesson 5 in Making It Meaningful, Transition Assessment for Students who are Deaf and Lower Functioning. In this particular segment, we're going to focus on the unique transition needs of students who are deaf and lower functioning. Before we do that, however, in this first segment, we're going to talk about what I would refer to as the tasks of transition. And these are tasks that exist regardless of whether you have a disability or not. So as we think about the idea of moving from adolescence to adulthood, some of the things that any of us, as we made that transition, had to be able to accomplish related to, are we able to live independently? How much confidence do we have in that? Are we ready for a job? What kinds of skills, knowledge, abilities do we need to have in terms of job readiness? As moving to adulthood, we also have to get a better knowledge of healthcare, taking care of our own bodies, as well as understanding sexuality and relationships with other people. So as we look at this, the idea of independent living, job readiness, knowledge of healthcare and sexuality, and just general social maturity and social skills, all of those are tasks that any adolescent has to be able to accomplish to make a successful transition into adulthood. Now, having said that, I'd like to spend a few moments talking about the idea of if you're deaf and low functioning, how do these tasks of transition, how are they affected? So again, going back to our original definition, that these individuals, their hallmark characteristic is communication deficits. So then when we think about that, they have, would affect, if you have a communication deficit, it would affect all those aspects of transition. Many of these students have additional disabilities, as we've mentioned, and those additional disabilities, particularly if they're vision related or mobility related, can pose significant additional barriers for individuals. And then if we think about this as far as, transition and individuals who are deaf and low functioning, the idea that they may come from a lower socioeconomic background is not at all unexpected. And as such, if you're in that kind of environment, your access to appropriate services and professionals and so forth is also limited. Now, let's talk about transition planning in this segment, in segment 5.2. And if we think about the idea of making a transition plan, and so now we've switched from talking about students in general to students with disabilities. Because again, as many of you know, there is an assumption or in fact, actually regulation that said for students who have disabilities, there should be put in place some type of transition plan. And so from my standpoint, I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the things that might be in a transition plan, or at least the process. And one of the most important things I would mention is the idea that when you make these plans, involve the students in themselves, all right? And that might be problematic, I recognize, because on the one hand, we're saying these are students who have communication deficits as their hallmark characteristic. On the other hand, it's disrespectful, disempowering, whatever word we want to use, to not, to whatever extent they are able, try to enjoin them, try to get a sense of what their preference is and encourage them to participate. A transition plan not only facilitates the student's involvement, but it includes others, including family, VR, any local community agencies who might be appropriate. When we think about a transition plan, part of it, because it's a plan, is this idea of looking toward the future. And that requires oftentimes the opportunity for some real work experience, trials, the idea of a place then train kind of a model, that we want to be able to give these individuals the opportunity to get out there, because if just looked at on a skill basis or communication basis alone, might not be successful. Once placed with supports, can definitely be successful. And then the fourth part of the transition plan is the idea that not only do we think about involving the student, getting people involved, thinking about it in the real world, but when we're thinking of the real world, who are the natural supports? Who are the people, whether they're family members, friends, job coaches, co-workers, whomever, but who are out there that might be used to help maintain things? Because realistically, we can't keep an intervention going the rest of a person's life. We can, however, help them build in and facilitate the development of natural supports. So as we think about this, we've got this idea of what a transition plan might look like. but there are certainly a number of barriers to planning. The first one will come as no surprise: lack of expertise. Many of the educators, many of the evaluators, even people within vocational rehabilitation, oftentimes don't necessarily have the expertise and knowledge as it relates to adults who are deaf and low functioning. Another barrier to planning has to do with resources. That I hear much more often that it's a time and money issue than it's a lack of desire or recognition that, oh, these people don't need it, but time and money get in the way. Attitudes are also problematic. With individuals who are deaf and low functioning, the communication barrier is problematic, and people tend to be very protective, tend to be very cautious, and also there's a sense of if a person acts differently. When my brother was growing up, for example, he would do a lot of self-stim. And by that, I mean he would rock back and forth, he'd make noises, all right? Now, if people see things like that, it tends to put them off, makes them uncomfortable. Attitudes, even now are still problematic. So that can be a barrier to transition, is even finding people, employers and community settings. As a very quick tangent, I will tell you there's a study done by Housing and Urban Development in Chicago. It's only a few years old. And they did a study where they set people who were non-disabled, people who used wheelchairs, and people who pretended to be deaf, and had them call and ask about community living options. And guess what? If you were non-disabled, landlords were very open to talking to you. But if you identified yourself as using a wheelchair or identified yourself as deaf, you face serious housing discrimination. In fact, in this report, it says that those deaf individuals faced greater housing discrimination than any other group that HUD had studied before. More than women, more than race, more than socioeconomic class, that disability was a huge limiting factor in terms of attitudes about living in the community. And the final barrier I'll mention has to do with, just as we've talked on and on, socioeconomic status, that how much money you have access to makes a huge amount of difference. Or even if you have money, if you live in a rural environment where services aren't readily available, that can also be a barrier to planning. In this next segment, I want to talk about what I'm going to consider to be suggestions for treatment planning. And one of the most important parts of this, as we think of treatment planning, has to do with the idea of focus on what's next. Okay? We're not talking about diagnosis. We're not talking about classification. We're talking about assessment planning for transition. So the idea is look at what's next. What do we need to build on? What strengths can we find? What supports can we find? And as I said in the previous segment, you have to involve the student and family in the planning. We need to review, implement, and make sure that transition plans are actually put in place. We also include in this planning process important others, and those could be family members, could be educators, could be community agencies. A variety of individuals have input and can be valuable in this process. So when we think about the transition plan, the basic goal is, we're facilitating everyone's involvement in this. We're also trying to develop real-world supports because, again, remember, we're not going to be able to give a standardized test in an office setting and have that have any real meaning for us as we take that out into the real world. So can't emphasize enough the idea of real-world trials with appropriate supports. And when I say appropriate supports, another quick example. My brother David came to live with me about 15 years ago and got him a job at the local grocery store. Now, David has a very good work ethic. You tell him what to do, he knows what to do. And he was a bagger, right? So they had him being a bagger. And he was great, showed up on time, no problem, except for one thing. And the one thing that was problematic for David was when a customer wanted paper versus plastic. Because as you know, there's an inclination that if you're putting your groceries away, they're going to use plastic. Well, that was problematic because David didn't hear if they said paper. And so that was almost a job breaker for him. But you know what the simple solution was? He got a little name tag that says, "Hello, my name's David. I'm deaf. Please get my attention if you want paper." Now, it was a little more concise than that, but it's that idea that all it took was a name tag, and he was able to successfully do the job as well as make the customers feel comfortable as well. Another point as we think about transition planning is, you've heard me say this, I'll continue to say it, you can't rely just on, in fact should rely very little on standardized testing, but there are a variety of other sources of information, rating scales, interviews, observations. We'll talk about functional ecological assessment here in our subsequent lessons, but the idea is don't just rely on a score or one method of getting information, particularly for students who present with such a diversity of backgrounds and experiences. And as part of this overall plan, as we think about making a transition plan, and again, we'll go into this more in the next lesson, but you have to know what's available to you. If I live in rural Illinois, there are far few opportunities for employment, for training, for general support than if I live in Chicago, right? So as we think of these things, where you live makes a difference. So you have to assess the local resources, opportunities, and supports as part of an effective transition plan. Okay, now in this next segment, I want to talk, segment 5.4, talk a little bit about some of the supports that are out there to facilitate transition planning. I'm going to really emphasize those things that are most readily available online. And I'll be honest with you, there's really not a lot out there as it relates to transition of deaf adolescents for coming up with tasks and skills and so forth. There have been materials out there in the past, given my history, I know about them, but I'm not able, in a search I did in preparation for this training, I found very, very little that's out there. So the two things that I'd like you to at least have some awareness with or some knowledge of have to do with online resources. One is called the Iowa Expanded Core Curriculum, and the other is the TAGG Transition Assessment and Goal Generator. Now, I do have listed the URLs for them. We all know URLs may not last forever, but if they do go away, certainly just do a search for the term. If we think about the Iowa Expanded Core Curriculum, fairly recently revised 2013, deals with knowledge related to audiology, career education, communication, family education, functional skills, self-determined advocacy, social emotional skills, technology. So quite a range of things. And within each of those, you can look them up and it will give you some ideas for how to assess as well as intervene on each of those. Another thing that would be valuable to look at is the TAGG, TAGG, Transition Assessment and Goal Generator. Its intended users are, post-secondary students with mild to moderate disabilities. So again, it's not specifically for deafness, but it has things that can be helpful. And it includes 34 items across 8 different areas with a focus on strengths and needs to produce, an appropriate assessment plan. The areas that it looks at have to do with ideas of strengths and limitations, awareness of disability, their persistence, the idea of how do they interact with others. So those are the first 4. Second 4 have to do with goal setting. Are they able, how do they approach goal setting? How about employment, knowledge, understanding, awareness? The 7th is, how have they been involved in the IEP? Certainly some students have more or less opportunities to do that. And then the final area that the TAGG looks at relates to the support in the community. So either one of those, the Iowa skills or the TAGG, either one could be very valuable in at least helping you generate some additional ideas for what could be dealt with within a transition plan. With the TAGG, I've said here just real quickly, there's 3 different versions for the professional, the student, and the family. Inexpensive. It's only $3, and you can get it through their website. So as we summarize this lesson was really intended to focus on low functioning, deaf, and transition. So we started off talking a little bit about what some of the major transition issues are, because again, for all of us, transition is a normal part of life. We all hopefully move from adolescence into adulthood. So how does that happen? And we deal with things like independence, community living, social skills, healthcare awareness, right? And yet, when we think about it as it pertains to these students who are deaf and low functioning, if you have a communication barrier, all those tasks of transitioning to adulthood are impacted. So independence is impacted. Jobs, living in the community, your social skills. If you have limited communication skills, it has an impact on all of those. So from my standpoint, as we think about this, we recognize these issues. So it does put on us a greater burden or greater level of responsibility to think about how we create and how we implement transition plans. And one of the ways in which I suggested it was not only getting as many people involved who have direct knowledge and awareness of the student, but also dealing with and taking advantage of online resources, because those online resources can be particularly helpful as you move forward. So we'll end lesson 5 there. And in lesson 6, what I'm going to do is we're going to spend a bit more time talking about specific assessment approaches, specific strategies you can use to make sense of transition issues for deaf students who are lower functioning.